Before European powers arrived, the social fabric of Burundi was woven with complex threads of identity. Hutu, Tutsi, and the TWA lived in overlapping social categories rather than rigid tribes. A Hutu was traditionally associated with farming. A Tutsi with cattle could, through wealth or service, join the ranks of the elite. Local loyalties and the Kirundi language bound communities together. Intermarriage and shared culture blurred rigid divisions, at least until colonial rule. German and later Belgian colonizers altered that balance. The Belgians elevated Tutsi elites and hardened social categories into a racial caste. Tutsis were given preferential access to education, civil service, and the army. This favoritism sowed resentment and laid the groundwork for future conflict. A brittle peace emerged, one built on inequality and fear. The colonial legacy would not be easily erased. It became the defining tragedy of post-independence Burundi. Burundi gained independence on July 1, 1962, inheriting a fraught political system. Prince Louis Rwagasore, a popular nationalist, offered a brief glimmer of unity. Tragically, Rwagasore was assassinated weeks after his victory. His death left a power vacuum and hardened ethnic politics. A failed coup in 1965 led to brutal purges of Hutu politicians and officers. The Tutsi-dominated army became the arbiter of power. In 1966, the monarchy was abolished. Captain Michel Micombero seized power and declared the republic with himself as president. Micombero's regime purged Hutu influence from the army, police, judiciary, and civil service. This consolidation created a deeply polarized and fearful society. A hardline Tutsi faction, especially from Bururi, held the reins of state, an arrangement that made any spark extremely dangerous. By the spring of 1972, simmering tensions had reached a boiling point. A decade of marginalization and violent purges left Hutu communities desperate. On the evening of April 29, 1972, coordinated rebellions erupted in the south. Groups of Hutu militants, some trained across the border, launched simultaneous attacks in Rumonge and Bururi. The initial attacks were brutal. Tutsi civilians, soldiers, men, women, and children were killed. In places, the rebels declared the short-lived Republic of Martiazo. The rebellion lacked coordination, was poorly equipped, and remained geographically isolated in the south. They never threatened Bujumbura or major military installations. State radio framed the uprising as a genocidal Hutu campaign to exterminate Tutsis, a narrative that would justify a terrible retaliation. Propaganda conflated rebel actions with the entire Hutu population. The spark had landed on dry tinder, and the state prepared to fan it into an inferno. President Michel Micombero's response was not chaotic. It was swift, systematic, and planned. The Tutsi-dominated forces Armées Burundaises mobilized within days. Military units swept through the south, often aided by armed civilian Tutsi militias and the JRR Youth Wing. The counteroffensive was swift and merciless. Hutu men, boys, students, teachers, priests. People were rounded up in markets, schools, and churches. There were no trials, no due process. The regime drew up lists of educated and influential Hutus, intellectuals, teachers, civil servants, doctors. People were arrested by name and loaded onto army trucks, never to be seen again. Victims were taken to execution sites, riverbanks, and remote fields. Killings were carried out with hammers or bayonets to conserve ammunition. The aim was clear, to decapitate Hutu society by eliminating its leaders and future leaders. Genocide, defined by the 1948 UN Convention, requires intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a group. The state's response in 1972 meets this legal threshold. The machinery of genocide was methodical: lists, orders, checkpoints. At the University of Burundi, Tutsi students were sometimes asked to point out Hutu classmates. Anyone with secondary education or higher, teachers, doctors, civil servants, were targets. Within months, much of the Hutu intellectual and professional class had been wiped out. Parents discouraged education, fearing it would become a death sentence for their children. A lost generation of Hutu leaders was the intended outcome. In the capital and provinces, a climate of terror took hold. Army trucks became a symbol of death. Mass graves and empty institutions testified to an organized campaign of extermination. This was not simply a counterinsurgency. It was a calculated selective genocide aimed at destroying Hutu leadership. Quantifying the human cost is a somber and difficult task. Estimates vary. Historians and survivor testimonies provide the basis for our numbers. The initial rebellion killed between 800 and 1,200 Tutsis. The state's retaliatory campaign killed an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 Hutus. Hundreds of thousands fled to Tanzania, Rwanda, and Zaire. Many suffered disease, malnutrition, and deep psychological trauma in exile. The flight from the south hollowed out communities and devastated the economy. Refugee camps incubated future resistance movements. New groups emerged, including Palipa Hutu and armed wings that later fought for change. Those who grew up in exile would return decades later as fighters and leaders. The grim calculus was not just the dead, but a fractured nation and a diaspora haunted by loss. The 1972 genocide cast a long shadow over Burundi's politics and identity. Its effects echoed for decades and shaped the nation's DNA. In the immediate aftermath, Micombero consolidated Tutsi power and the Hutu elite was gone. A hollow peace was enforced by fear and military control. When Burundi elected its first Hutu president, Melchior Ndadaye, in 1993, the past returned with vengeance. His assassination by Tutsi army officers plunged the country into a decade of civil war. The unresolved hatreds of 1972 helped fuel another 300,000 deaths during the Civil War. Survivors still bear the scars. Communities remember in different and competing ways. There has been no comprehensive truth and reconciliation to fully address 1972. The topic remains sensitive, often unspoken. A ghost in national politics. We remember Rwagasore, Micombero, Intare 5, Melchior Ndadaye, and the countless unnamed victims. And we must learn from the Akiza so such horrors never recur.